In 1982, succession at one company would end up changing the wrestling industry forever.
The thing you have to remember is, as of 1982, Vince Sr. was dying. Vince Sr. was sick.
Vince Sr. was Vincent James McMahon. He owned a notable wrestling promotion in the Northeast U.S. His son, Vince Jr., was Vincent Kennedy McMahon, and he wanted to take it over.
One of the great mysteries is exactly how you got from Vince Sr. wanting to cash out to Vince being the owner of the company, because it didn't happen in the way you would think. You'd think, okay, well, Vince Sr. must have just left the company to his son and said, hey, take over for me, son. No. Vince Sr. did not have that kind of trust or affection towards Vince Jr.
So what Vince Sr. does is he creates this plan where Vince Jr. has to make a series of payments called balloon payments.
The deal isn't even closed. For the next year, he has to make 4 payments, quarterly installments, to his father and the minority shareholders of the company. And he had to pay over $1 million to them. And the nature of a balloon payment is, if you miss any of the payments, not only do you not get the company, you don't get back any of the money that you already paid. So it was a very punishing payment schedule. And I think there was probably some degree of Vince convincing his father that he would play by the rules. Because the way Vince has always portrayed what happened was, he says, if my father had known what I was going to do with the company, he never would have sold it to me.
What Vince wanted was to make an empire out of the regional wrestling business his father had carefully built over a career. And he'd do so in a series of never-been-done-before deals that broke the rules of the industry and put himself at the center of it all.
Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the WWE, Mr. McMahon!
This is The Closer, our show about deals and deal makers that change the world. I'm Amy Keene. My guest this week has spent a lot of time thinking about Vince McMahon, both the business executive and the wrestling character.
Vince was somebody who had echoed in my brain since I was a kid.
Abraham Josephine Riesman grew up watching wrestling. Today, she's an arts and culture writer and author of the book Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America.
Vince just seemed like not only was he a driving force in the transformation that our society has gone through, he is at the very least probably the best case study in how you build an empire in the attention economy and how you get people to enrich you in their hatred of you.
Screw you! You're fired! You're fired! Whoa! You're fired! You're fired!
We'll be right back. The person we know today as Vince McMahon, executive chairman of the WWE, was actually born Vinnie Lupton.
Because his father, his biological father, Vincent James McMahon, who I guess we'll just call Vince Sr., as he is known in the industry now, Vince Sr. had abandoned young Vinnie and his brother Rod and their mother, and that happened right around when Vince was born in 1945. So he did not know his father. In that time, he didn't even really watch wrestling.
But wrestling was already the family business. Vince Sr. was a notable wrestling promoter, and his father had been a famous boxing and wrestling promoter himself.
And Vince Sr. was kind of living high on the hog, while Vince Jr., the Vince of this story, was living in dirt poverty in semi-rural North Carolina, while his father is up in the D.C. area and doing business in New York.
One day, when Vinnie's 12 years old, he gets a call from Vince Sr.'s second wife, Juanita. She wants to arrange a meetup between Vince Sr. and his kids.
It must have been the strangest moment in young Vinnie's life. Vince has very rarely talked about this. I only found out about the details of that meetup from an unpublished interview that I found on micro cassette from a reporter who used to work for the in-house magazine of WWE, where he spilled the beans about what his relationship with his parents was like, at least to a certain extent. And it wasn't pretty. His mother and his stepfather, this had been said in another interview, allegedly were abusive towards him. Then he, at age 12, meets his dad, goes to the glittering aisles of New York City, and all of a sudden has this entirely new prospect for his life, which is getting involved in professional wrestling.
He is quite young at the time, but do you have a sense of what he was after or what he wanted after this meeting?
What does any child want? The love of a parent. And the fact is, Vince Sr. kind of wasn't interested in that. And Vince never stopped trying to get his father's respect and love. I think he ended up not only getting into wrestling, but learning a lot from his father that you might qualify as sort of the dark arts of wrestling promotion.
The dark arts of wrestling promotion. The wrestling of Vince Sr.'s day combined tradition from two different worlds. That of the traveling carnival, where performers would stage matches that looked real but were actually fixed, and the world of legitimate sports.
This is always the hardest part of any interview is like, how do I summarize all of pro wrestling in a soundbite? It's something that's so confusing and so bizarre and so uniquely American that it's very hard to put into words. But basically, in Vince Sr.'s day, wrestling was billed to the public as a legitimate sporting competition when, in fact, it was not.
Mm-hmm. This is the idea of kayfabe.
This is the idea, yes, that we would later come to know wrestlers had been calling behind the scenes kayfabe, Kayfabe. It was a long-running Carney term that was used in wrestling. It is an unclear linguistic origin, but it may be Pig Latin for be fake. And the idea was, if you were talking to any outsider to wrestling, you could not admit that what you did was fake, both in terms of the actual sport, the grappling, but also in terms of your character and in terms of the nature of what the show people would go to was. You had to really commit to the kayfabe of the match, of the business. And that kayfabe was always a tension between fantasy and reality because the public needs to believe wrestling is real.
The business of this type of wrestling operated like a series of regional fiefdoms around the country. Sure, there might be some promotions in different parts of the U.S., but each wrestling lord, if you will, usually stuck to his territory. A young Vince tried to find his way into his father's operation, what was then called the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, but he was routinely dismissed by the senior Vince. That is until one day when he catches a break. On the night of a televised wrestling show, his father unceremoniously fires the longtime announcer over a salary dispute, and then tells Vince, "You're going to be the announcer."
Hello, everyone, and welcome to All American Wrestling, and a Happy New Year to you all. This is Vince McMahon reporting.
Which was, weirdly, the best job Vince ever could have gotten in wrestling, because he didn't have power the way his father did, but he was somebody who could subtly influence the viewer or the listener of the broadcasts.
On top of announcing, Vince tries to push further into wrestling. He's now married to his childhood sweetheart, Linda, and together they launch their own business called Titan Sports. They work on a promotion for Vince Sr. up in Maine, take over a Cape Cod sports venue, and end up falling into personal bankruptcy together all before 1980. But by the early 80s, Vince sets his sights on another opportunity, one that would establish him as a powerful new force in the world of wrestling, buying his dad's company.
For the most part, wrestling was regarded as this sideshow, and Vince wanted to take this regional art form and his regional company within that and turn that company into, Major League Baseball, except for wrestling. That was the dream he had. And what Vince was proposing was the most radically destabilizing move in the history of wrestling, which was, let's just drive everybody else out of business.
After the deal closes, he quickly sets in motion a series of moves to take the WWF national and blow up the way the industry's operated for years. The first move is to take over a promotion on the West Coast.
The LaBelle family had been dominant in Southern California wrestling for a while, and they had a good relationship with Vince Sr. There had been this little organization called like the Atlantic Pacific Wrestling Corporation, I believe it was called, that was kind of an informal, I mean, it was formal, but loose agreement between the LaBelles and Vince Sr. to, share talent occasionally, do shows, whatever. But it was not a merger. This was very much two discrete companies that had a joint agreement. And then when Vince takes over, Vince Jr., that is, Mike LaBelle was in rough financial straits, and Vince saw an opportunity. And he did something completely crazy, which was he bought the Southern California promotion, and then abruptly his company is bicoastal. No territory had been in charge of New York and Los Angeles before. It was a stunning development. So that was one of the first big steps that Vince took towards national dominance, was essentially closing in the country, or at least the continental United States, with that deal.
So he's got 2 physical territories now, but he wants to be even bigger. The next move is to turn to television.
One of the main rivals to Vince Jr. and his World Wrestling Federation was a company called Georgia Championship Wrestling, or GCW. They had a TV show called World Championship Wrestling. And long story short, Vince was given an opportunity by somebody who was a bit of a turncoat from Georgia Championship Wrestling to buy a controlling interest in that company. So Vince and Linda buy a controlling interest in Georgia Championship Wrestling without telling basically anybody. And then on July 14th, 1984, you were watching wrestling.
On behalf of WTBS, it's a pleasure to welcome the World Wrestling Federation. Exciting new matches, and here's the man to tell you all about it. Here's Vince McMahon. Vince?
And abruptly, at the very top of the show, who does the announcer call in but Vince McMahon, and says, here's the new person in charge of our company, Vince McMahon.
Thank you very much, Freddie. Welcome aboard.
Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure to be associated with WTBS, and we promise to bring you the greatest in professional wrestling entertainment in the world today.
I say in the book, it's not unlike, for a wrestling fan, watching the State of the Union, and all of a sudden the person who comes up to the podium is not the president, but, the premier of the Soviet Union. It was the primary rival to World Wrestling Federation, and yet here it is. World Wrestling Federation is in charge. And the most important thing was, this was a show on cable, because Georgia Championship Wrestling had a deal with Ted Turner, and Ted Turner had launched TBS, the first superstation. So all of a sudden, Vince is doing this nationally broadcast cable show.
The day would become known among the wrestling world as Black Saturday.
And Black Saturday is called that because it was a moment when wrestling fans, especially Southern wrestling fans, realized that their preferred form of wrestling was under possibly mortal threat.
One of the things that I find so interesting about this particular deal is that what he's looking for here is that national syndication, that national broadcast opportunity. But in recent years, if someone was looking, if an executive was looking for that kind of reach, you'd probably think of them going, to negotiate a series or a single syndication deal. But instead, he just buys out the promotion that has the TV deal that he wants.
This is classic Vince. He's an outside the box thinker. He is somebody who looks at an impasse and thinks, well, how can I not maneuver around this, but just break through it, just destroy it? But the GCW deal, no one had ever seen anything like that, because Vince was one of the first people to realize that if you can take what's happening behind the scenes and suggest that it's happening in a way that causes fans and viewers to go, wait, what's really going on? And that urge to figure out what the hell is going on has been Vince's bread and butter for decades. And Black Saturday was, I would argue, sort of the first big display of that. It was just saying, hey, you like drama? Well, we've got drama outside the ring too, and you can sort of be a part of that if you keep watching.
Drama came in the way he scooped up talent, too. He'd find up-and-coming performers and woo them away from their current gig with more money than they'd find anywhere else.
The big name that you know from the 80s, if you were alive in the 80s and vaguely conscious, is Hulk Hogan.
I gotta tell you, folks, wait till Hulk Hogan comes out here. The roof is gonna come off the Bell Center here in Montreal.
So there was this phenomenon called Hulkamania that was happening in the AWA, American Wrestling Association.
You're talking about a man 6'8". You're talking about a man in body weight. You're talking about 340 pounds of twisted steel and sex appeal. You're talking about Hulk Hogan, the heartthrob.
And then as Vern Gagne is getting ready to send out this highlight reel to television stations saying, hey, look at my amazing new wrestler, just as that's happening, Vince swoops in, has a private meeting with Hulk Hogan, and signs him to WWF. And all of a sudden, Hulkamania is a WWF phenomenon. And, you know, in order to get people on board, he just offered them a lot of money, which they'd never seen before, because these were guys who were used to just doing it for $20 and beer and maybe some tail at a local wrestling event. That's what these men were used to. And then all of a sudden Vince shows up and starts offering them big TV money. And more importantly, licensing deals. That was a huge thing, was you could get money from merchandise with your face on it. Then people were willing to come over.
The fourth big move was the creation of something called WrestleMania.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to WrestleMania.
WrestleMania 1, which was held in March of 1985, was this multimedia spectacle unlike anything that had ever been tried in wrestling.
A one-night event at Madison Square Garden featuring multiple wrestling matches between the biggest WWF names, as well as celebrity referees and timekeepers.
As they're hanging off the rafters just here in Madison Square Garden. That's right, WrestleMania, Gino. WrestleMania. It's living up to everything I expected it to be, Gino Monsoon. I'm keyed up. Chico Santana against the man.
And you had Mr. T and Hulk Hogan hosting SNL the night before WrestleMania.
We came to Saturday Night Live for one reason, brother. We haven't been eating any food all week. We've been drinking grapefruit juice and eating skinny little chickens. And tonight, my main man T told me if we came to Saturday Night Live, we'd get a laugh. Because this is the best darn show in the whole wild world.
WrestleMania was something that Vince successfully hyped up to the rafters. And about 1 million people watched that first one, which is not that many in today's numbers, but was huge for a wrestling show. And of course, it only went upward from there, and WrestleMania became an annual event. But this is the kind of fearless, weird guy that Vince is. He really believed it would take off, and he was right.
That fearlessness translated to money. The company brought in $63 million in 1985, more than double that of the previous year. And the business itself, which had operated on cash deals and backroom handshakes for decades, was becoming much more corporate under Vince's reign. How did the product change from Vince Sr.'s ownership to Vince's?
Vince was pretty much the creative force in those early years of his ownership of the WWF. The wrestling product that Vince was creating became much more TV-ified. It was an event that prior to Vince's takeover had largely been shaggy. The matches weren't necessarily very explosive. And Vince decided, okay, let's make this like a regular sporting program. Let's have flashy graphics. Let's have theme music. Let's have all of this stuff to get people juiced up. And more importantly, the content became much more noticeably fake or questionably real at the very least. And he also started, he being Vince, started using a new term to describe the product that was made, which is sports entertainment. And that was another little subtle hint that maybe what you were watching was not entirely on the level.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back...
Nobody in a regulatory position or any other position of power wanted to be seen as taking wrestling seriously. And that's how those abuses were allowed to continue.
Vince McMahon's ruthless expansion made the WWF a powerful force in U.S. wrestling, but it also cultivated a cruel and callous culture. There was the steroid use and substance abuse among many performers, but more seriously, there were allegations that McMahon's lieutenants had sexually assaulted young boys who worked promotions, domestic violence allegations against some performers, and in more than one case, allegations of murder against certain wrestlers. And then against Vince himself, an allegation he raped the first female referee in the WWF. Yet McMahon and the WWF seemed to avoid scrutiny.
Nobody in a regulatory position or any other position of power wanted to be seen as taking wrestling seriously. This is the original sin of politicians and the media when it comes to wrestling, is people tend to assume because they think the product is silly, the process that made it must have been silly as well. You know, that is not true. It's a very brutal industry. And the fact is, no one was paying attention because they thought it was dumb. Or, on top of that, you had people who were paying close attention, thought of it as fake, and were willing to defend it to the death because they loved it as a product so much. So it's a real perfect storm of conditions that lead to people turning a blind eye. And that's how those abuses were allowed to continue.
That changed in the early 90s. Victims of sexual assault and the victim of Vince's alleged rape came forward. News broke that the Department of Justice was investigating the WWF on, quote, allegations of sexual abuse of minors. But the federal case that would take Vince to court was not about sexual abuse. The DOJ charged him and his company, Titan Sports, with illegal distribution of steroids.
The Justice Department seems to have wanted to crack down on Vince in one way or another in the early 90s. They ended up bringing a case about steroid distribution.
Prosecutors zeroed in on one particular alleged exchange in New York.
And they couldn't prove that it happened. And the case fell apart, and Vince was found, he was acquitted. You know, it was not ultimately a problem for him. If anything, it was a huge advantage.
Now, some executives might have taken this run-in with the Justice Department as a warning to rein it in. But Vince was emboldened.
You see this real shift in Vince's personality and approach to the media after that. He decides, okay, my new stance towards the media is screw you. My new stance towards the government is I beat you. You can't touch me. And you see this new, more confident, not that he was ever that unconfident, but more confident and more defiant and insulting Vince McMahon. That's who emerges out of the ashes of his very rough early 90s.
He takes this new approach and writes himself into the WWF as a character with his own storyline.
Well, the necessary preface to that is in 1989, Vince killed kayfabe. Kayfabe, as it had existed for a century, died in February of 1989 when the New York Times and the New York Post ran big stories on the deregulation effort that Vince was undertaking in various states, and in various lawsuits. He was also defending himself. And in all of these cases, he was telling people in private, whether they were legislators or lawyers, hey, this is all fake. Don't worry about it. It's all fake. You don't need to regulate me, and I'm not liable for anything. And eventually, once this got reported in 1989 in those big stories, that was the end of the public illusion that was already a bit threadbare about wrestling's legitimacy. And that was a huge hit to wrestling because for the next few years, you have real diminishing returns.
Diminishing returns for the industry as a whole, and especially so at the WWF. In Josie's words, wrestling got silly and lost some of its allure. One of Vince's main competitors, Ted Turner's World Championship Wrestling, manages to pick up some market share during this period, beating out WWF in the ratings wars.
This brings us to Vince's decision to enter the stream of his own storytelling in 1996 and 1997, and then especially in 1998. What happens is you get the development of this phenomenon that I term as neo-kayfabe. Neo-kayfabe is when you're telling the audience not, hey, everything here is real, but rather, hey, everything here is fake. Don't worry about it. It's all scripted. Now let's get on with the show. But the key here is you're not just saying it's all fake. You're saying it's all fake except for the parts that are going to be real. And that is the magic nature of neo-kayfabe, is you get to pick what you think is real. You get to choose your own reality. Once you get into neo-kayfabe, you're in a hall of mirrors.
This hall of mirrors becomes a central part of WWF matches after Vince executes something called the Montreal Screwjob in 1997. To sum it up briefly, he flipped the script on star wrestler Bret Hart during a match without telling him. Bret lost a match he was expecting to win, and Vince McMahon emerged as the villain of the story to fans.
And Vince, in a genius move, decides, I'm going to be a villain now on the show, not just behind the scenes. I'm just going to say I'm evil and a liar and can't be trusted. I'm going to say it openly. And then after that, what are they going to do? I already said it. I admitted it. This was Vince's insight. He decided, I'm going to make money off of the fact that people despise me by getting out there and juicing interest in myself and my promotion through evil acts. And it worked tremendously well. Mr. McMahon, as the character of Vince McMahon came to be known, was the fulcrum point of the entire promotion for a number of years. Everything revolved around Mr. McMahon, and people couldn't get enough of it. The storylines became extremely offensive, and that was the idea. It was just what gets people riled up. That was the point.
The storylines were more physically violent, filled with more bigotry, misogyny, and sexual violence than the WWF had entertained before. But this new approach brought in viewers, and it rebalanced the company's coffers. 1999 turns out to be WWF's best year on record at that point, with $250 million in revenue. By this point, McMahon's brought his two adult kids, Stephanie and Shane, into the business and into the ring with their own storylines. Then he and Linda seal the company's corporate evolution by going public, making the two of them billionaires in the process. Meanwhile, McMahon's deal-making continues. He takes over rival promotion WCW. Then he picks up the pieces of another promotion that's gone bankrupt. He changes the company name from WWF, the World Wrestling Federation, to WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment, thanks to a lawsuit from the environmental group that also used the acronym WWF. He now controls wrestling in the US and Canada and becomes a powerful force beyond the ring, too. You make the case in the book that Vince McMahon is responsible or more responsible for the current state of American politics than a lot of people probably, or at least might recognize. Tell me what you mean by that.
You remember, you weren't even watching wrestling, but you remember the late 90s. You couldn't avoid wrestling. And that era of wrestling, that late 90s wrestling, was the height of neo-kayfabe. This was a massively influential cultural product for a whole generation of people. But in a more direct way, Vince is just a major Republican player. Vince, and especially his wife, Linda. They are very close with the Trumps, and Trump has been very influenced by Vince's approach to wrestling. Trump's image was deeply influenced by his appearances in the wrestling programming, culminating in WrestleMania in 2007.
I'm taller than you. I'm better looking than you. I think I'm stronger than you.
And once you have Trump in the White House, or even before that, once you have Trump dominating the airwaves and bringing this pro wrestling infused neo-kayfabe approach to politics, it was so instantly appealing to a broad swath of the public that there's no going back. And what's really dangerous is you have a combination of people going, it's all bullshit, I'll just watch it for the spectacle, or it's all bullshit except for my secret theory about what's really going on. And that's how you get QAnon, it's how you get Russiagate conspiracy theorizing, it's how you completely lose your mind. Vince's rise and the kind of product that Vince managed to win with both tell us a lot about the mess we're in right now.
In 2022, the Wall Street Journal reports that McMahon is under investigation by the company's board of directors for millions of dollars in alleged hush money payments to women with whom he'd had sexual relationships, women who worked for the WWE.
Allegations have emerged involving WWE billionaire CEO Vince McMahon.
The company says Vince will step back as chairman and CEO during the investigation. His daughter Stephanie will step up for the day-to-day operations. But then WWE makes another announcement, saying Mr. McMahon, Vince's in-ring character, would be making an announcement on the next live episode of a WWE show called SmackDown.
So, the opening credits roll, and then Vince's music hits.
Mr. McMahon!
It's this very intimidating song called No Chance in Hell. And out he walks. The crowd is a mix of cheers and boos. They don't quite know what to make of him. He walks to the ring, takes the microphone, and proceeds to give a brief little address that has absolutely nothing to do with the allegations whatsoever. He gets up there and basically says, you know, the slogan of WWE is then, now, together, forever. And the most important word there is together. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to SmackDown. And he tossed aside the mic, and that was it. That was it. Didn't mention the allegations, nothing. It was just a declaration of, I'm here and you can't move me. I'm here. Sorry. It was an implicit declaration that nothing was going to take him down. And then a few weeks later, he did step back.
He announced he'd be retiring. The whole spectacle was reminiscent of the way McMahon responded to the doping indictment and acquittal. Whatever you might expect from a corporate CEO, Vince McMahon was always going to break those rules.
And I remember the Washington Post called me up and said, can you write an opinion piece about the end of the Vince McMahon era? And I said, I'll only write it if you let it be, this is not the end of the Vince McMahon era. And I said, the story here is Vince is still the principal shareholder of this company. It's a publicly traded company, as of then, and he is the largest individual shareholder and controls about 80% of the shareholder votes. He is not out of power. He can come back anytime he likes. And sure enough, flash forward to a few months after that, and Vince makes this stunning return where he ousts a bunch of people from the board, installs himself as executive chairman, and pursues a sale of the company.
A sale to Endeavor, the entertainment and media agency and owner of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, run by Hollywood mogul Ari Emanuel. And the price tag, $9.3 billion.
That's more than Disney paid for Star Wars and the Marvel characters combined. That's how valuable an entertainment property WWE is in the marketplace, or at least to its new owner, Ari Emanuel of Endeavor.
Is there some kind of vindication in there for Vince about who ultimately now owns the company?
Oh, this is the big question for me, is what is the future of this partnership, of this new structure where Endeavor and Ari Emanuel own a merged UFC, the mixed martial arts company, and WWE? You know, what do we do with this? Vince has not had a real boss, basically since his father, and as we discussed, that did not go well. Vince does not do well with taking orders from anybody. All I can say is good luck, Ari.
And that's the end of our show. But there's more from my conversation with Josie Riesman. In the Closer Extra episode on Brazen Plus, hear more from Josie on the way Vince McMahon influenced, even made, the entertainment and political culture we have today. You can hear it all on Brazen Plus on Apple Podcasts. The Closer is a production of Project Brazen in partnership with PRX. Our show is produced by Isabel Kirby McGowan and Ben Walsh. Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, Olivia Mead is our researcher, and Lucy Woods is head of research. Golda Arthur is our showrunner, and Bradley Hope and Tom Wright are executive producers. Megan Dean is programming manager, and Ryan Ho is design lead. Our marketing consultant is Maggie Taylor, and Noor Abdel Latif is our podcast strategist. I'm Amy Keene. Thanks for listening.